In this video, you will learn about the fundamental concept of variables. So variables are a fundamental concept of every programming language in the world. But what actually is a variable? Well, we can say that a variable is like a container in which we can store a value in order to use it over and over again in our code, instead of having to write the value each time that we want to use it. Okay? So let's actually get rid of this code here. And so let me show you how to declare a variable for the very first time. So we have to use the var keyword and then the name of the variable. And I'm going to call this one first name, then equal, and then the value that we want to assign to the variable. And in this case, what I want to assign is a text, a string called John. Okay, and then again, our semicolon at the end. And so with this, we just declared our very first variable. So the variable name here is first name, and the value that we assign to that variable is John. So you can basically think of this variable, this first name variable here, as a piece of memory in your computer in which this John string here is stored. So I used these quotes here to declare this text here, so this string. Okay, I could also have used the double quotes like this, but I think it's a bit more modern to simply use these single quotes. All right, so when we declare some text, we usually just use the single quotes just like this here. All right, so throughout this section here, I will be using variables about persons for all the examples. So stuff like names or jobs or age or something like that. So something defined persons. So let's now do again a console.log. And what we're going to log now is simply the first name variable. All right. And so what do you think will happen when we reload our page now? So let's take a look at that. And indeed, you see John now logged to our console. And that's because we assigned John to this variable. And then JavaScript can retrieve the value of this variable here, which we declared as John. And so first name here is effectively the same as John. Okay, does that make sense? Let's now declare another one. And again, we have to use var. And now let's say last name equal, then again I use these quotes, and then let's say that it's Smith. So John Smith. So that's the last name, and let's declare another one called age, and so let's say that John is 28 years old. And so you see that now it's no longer a string like we had here, but it's now a number. And so that means that it's a different data type. Okay, so here we have text, but here we have numbers. Okay, and so now this is a good time to actually talk about different data types in JavaScript. So in JavaScript, there are 5 different data types: number, string, boolean, undefined, and null. And so far, we have already seen the number and the string, right? Now, primitive data type just means that it's not for objects, unlike most things in JavaScript. So they are just simple, primitive, non-object data types. So first off, we have numbers again, and JavaScript numbers are always floating point numbers, which simply means that they always have decimals, even if we sometimes don't see or even don't define them. So for example, 5 is like having 5.0, all right? And in other programming languages, many times it doesn't work like this, and you have different data types for integers and decimals, but not in JavaScript. So here all numbers are simply float numbers, even if they look like integers. Next up, we have strings, which are simply a sequence of characters, and so they are just used for text, like we did in the example before with the last name and the first name. Next up, the Boolean data type is a logical data type that can only take one of the logical values, true or false. So to make it simple, a Boolean is always either true or false. Okay, and we will see why this is very important over the next lectures. Alright, and the next one is a bit more difficult to understand. So basically, undefined is the data type that is automatically assigned to a variable that doesn't have a value yet. Sounds a bit more complicated than it actually is, and don't worry, I'm going to show it to you a bit later, of course. But what matters here for now is that basically undefined means non-existent. Alright? And finally, there is another data type, which is quite similar to undefined, and that is null. So null also means non-existent, but it's slightly more specific. And again, we will take more about these two later on. Now, before we move on, there's something very important to note here, which is that JavaScript has a feature called dynamic typing. And this means that we do not have to manually define the data type of a variable, unlike in many other programming languages. So basically JavaScript automatically figures out if a variable is a string or a number, or if it's undefined or a boolean, and then assigns that data type to the variable without us having to do anything. Okay? And if we then later assign another value to the same variable, but with another data type, then JavaScript will automatically change the data type of the variable as well. So this can of course be very useful and save us some coding time, but it can also be the source of some difficult to find bugs, which means errors in our code. Okay, so we always have to be careful with what we do with our variables. Alright, and that's it. So let's now actually see these things in action again and move back to our code. So to show you the Boolean data type, let's create a variable here called full age. So var full age, and then say true. And remember that booleans can only be true or false, and so in here we can simply say true or false. Okay, so I could of course also have written false, but in this case, well, John is of course of full age with his 28 age. And so let's now take a look at the console when we log this variable here. So full age, the semicolon, and then reload it. And now you see here that it's true. Okay, so it also appears in a slightly different color here. This one is blue, and the John string here is black. All right. So here it also looks a bit different. So it's of course not in quotes. We simply write out true like this because it's a reserved JavaScript keyword. Okay, now before we move on in this lecture, I want to quickly talk about these variable names here. Okay, so it's a best practice in always giving our variables meaningful names. Instead of simply writing something like X or ABC or something like that, we should never do that. We should always say in our variables what we actually want. Okay, or what this variable actually means. So in this case here we have John, and that's a first name, and so we call this variable first name and not just some random sequence of characters. Okay, and the same of course for last name, age, and full age. And so again, that's a best practice. Of course, it would work the same if we say A, for example, and then A here. If we now log it to the console, then of course John is still here. But again, we want our variable names here to really have some meaning. Then this way of writing the variable name with this first word here and then the name, where I separated them with a capital letter here, that's the so-called camel case notation. Okay, so we could have done it like this. So first name all together, but then it would be kind of difficult to find where the second word starts. We could also have done it like with an underscore, but in JavaScript it's kind of a convention to use the camel case notation like this. Okay, so we start with a small letter in the beginning, and then when we have a second word, then that one starts with a capital letter. In the case of age here, for example, that's not the case because we only have one word. But then here again in full age, we have the second word here with this capital A. All right, so that's not about the JavaScript functionality itself. That's more of a programming convention and a best practice. Okay, moving on, let's define yet another one, and this one I'm going to call job. Now the difference here is that I'm not going to assign anything to this variable. Okay, so I can declare a variable but not assign a value to it. And so let's see what happens when we now take a look at this variable. And can you guess what's going to happen here? I hope you can. And indeed what we see here is now undefined, coming from script.js at line 11. So this line here prints undefined to the console. And remember that when I showed you that slide, I mentioned that undefined means not existent, and so that's the case. So we declared the variable, but we didn't assign any value to it. And so therefore job is simply undefined, and so that's what we see in the console. We can then later go ahead and assign something to it. So let's say job is teacher. And if we do the console log then again, and let's just copy it here, well, then we should see the teacher. And here we go. So from line 14 comes the teacher after we have declared it here in this line above. Okay, so we have strings here, we have numbers, we have a boolean, and we have also the undefined right here. And so these four are the most important data types that I wanted to show you. Now just to finish off this lecture very quickly, I want to show you some rules that we have to keep in mind when we name our variables. So I already talked about the best practices when naming them, So with this camel case notation that I explained before, but that was not really a rule, that was more of a best practice. But actually there are also some rules that we have to keep in mind. But don't worry, they're actually very simple. All you have to know is that variables cannot start with numbers or symbols except for the $sign or an underscore. Okay, so let's try to break some of these rules to see what happens. So var, and now I'm going to start a variable with a 3, so with a number. So let's try to say 3 years equals 3, and then reload the console. And now you see that we get an error here in line 16. And so this is here not valid. And again, because we cannot start a variable name with a number. All right, so I'm showing you this that in case you start naming your own variables, you don't run into these errors and then cannot figure out what this here means. So always take care and use these rules that I'm showing you here. Now, if we wanted to fix this here, we would either have to start with a number or with a $sign or an underscore. Okay, so these are the only symbols that can appear in a variable name here in JavaScript. So, for example, with the underscore, it would work just fine. With the $sign as well. But as soon as I start putting something else, like this, well, then again, we get the error here. Okay? And the same actually happens if I use a symbol in the middle of a variable name. So something like John/Mark, for example, John and Mark, and you will see that this here is not going to work again. Okay, so we have an error here at line 17 now, of course, but I want the error now on line 18, so let's take a look at that. And of course, it says unexpected token, which is this one. So in this case, we would of course use the camel case notation here to make it a lot better. And so now we don't have any error here anymore. So that was the first rule, that again, all variable names must start with either an underscore, a $sign, or a letter here. And then the second and last rule is that we cannot use reserved JavaScript keywords as variable names. So something like function, for example, is not going to work. So function equals 23, for example, and this will not really work. So you see unexpected token function. You can also not use something like delete, which is also a reserved keyword, and you will meet many of these keywords here throughout the course, of course. But right now just know that any of these keywords that we're going to use later, something like if, for example, you will not be able to use these as variable names. So variable names really need to be our own made up words and not the words that JavaScript already uses in its language. And alright, that's actually all there is to know about the fundamentals of variables and data types. So that's already a huge step forward and a very important concept in any programming language of the world. In the next video, we're going to dive a bit deeper into variables and do some more stuff with them. So stay tuned for that next video.